Good morning, everyone. So today I'm working with a slightly different setup because I'm at home. So I have my microphone here, my tablet here. I'll be referring to my notes and be talking to you guys. And I have my windows open because it's kind of warm, even though it's February. So there are some birds. I don't know if it makes the quality worse or maybe the bird sounds are peaceful. But anyways, let's get started. So today we're discussing the book The Courage to Be Happy by Fumitake Koga and Ichiro Kishimi. Sorry about the pronunciation, but I tried my best there. This book is the continuation of the original book, The Courage to Be Disliked. And I read The Courage to Be Disliked in July of 2023. And it was a hugely influential book, and it proposed a new life philosophy that I've contemplated and implemented specific aspects into my life. Since then, The Courage to Be Happy has been on my reading list, but I wanted to leave enough time between the two books to allow myself to take the original ideas of the first book on board, and then develop them further once they were fully integrated into my life. I decided that now would be the right time to read the next book. This is going to be a longer book review because there were so many great points in this book. So before we get started, I'd like to address some key points mentioned in the first book of the two-part series so that you have some context. These were the points that affected me the most, but explaining them lays a foundation for our further discussions in relation to this book, The Courage to Be Happy. The key concepts here were things such as the separation of tasks, as well as the rejection of trauma. That last point might sound a bit surprising, so let's break down these concepts. The separation of tasks essentially states that you should focus purely on your own life tasks and not make an attempt to influence or dictate other people's. For example, it is not your duty to tell somebody else what to do in their life. The only tasks you should focus on are your own, and you should accomplish these to the best of your ability without the expectation of somebody else doing something in return. Essentially, if you do something for somebody, you are making that decision on your own terms and you have no control over how they respond to it, so expecting a reward is foolish. Similarly, parents should not dictate their children's behavior. The goal of raising a child is for that child to become independent. If a parent dictates what the child should and shouldn't do, this prevents the child from making their own decisions and facing the consequences. Of course, parents should support their child and make it clear that they're there for assistance, but they should not make the decisions for the child. We will develop on these points later in the discussion, but this is just the basic principle of the separation of tasks. The rejection of trauma is also very thought-provoking. This essentially states how anybody is capable of starting their life off with a fresh start at any point in time. Trauma exists simply as a deterrent from a particular behavior. Everyone has the opportunity to start living the way they want to live, but if somebody doesn't want to make the necessary changes, they might use that trauma as an excuse. In a sense, they might find comfort in that trauma, as it provides them a way out of doing a certain behavior. There's no denying that traumatic experiences happen to people, and may hugely change the course of their lives, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they are capable of making any change they wish to make, starting today. With that being said, we have not discussed this in depth enough to form any opinions or come to a complete understanding. I've merely laid out the core principles so that we can delve deeper into this discussion. It's worth pointing out that this book is written in the form of a dialogue between a philosopher and a youth. I found this format to be really engaging while reading, as it essentially provides me with something I always desire while reading books: the ability to ask questions. It feels as if you're engaged in a conversation, rather than simply reading a book. The book puts forward the idea of Adlerian psychology, developed by the Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler. Let's have a look at the book. The youth in this book has chosen a path of education, but he's been struggling to maintain order within his classroom. He has trouble dealing with the problematic children in his classes, and he wishes to seek assistance from the philosopher. To develop on the idea of the separation of tasks, let's take a look at an extract in part 1 of the book. In Adlerian psychology, there's a way of thinking called separation of tasks, right? All sorts of things and events in life are regarded from the viewpoint of whose task is this, and divided into one's own tasks and other people's tasks. Say, for example, that my boss doesn't like me. Naturally, it doesn't feel good. It would be normal to make some effort to be liked and approved of by him somehow. But Adler judges that to be wrong. What kind of judgment do other people, in this case my boss, pass on my speech and conduct, and on me as a person. That is the boss's task, other people's tasks, and is not something I can control. No matter how much I try to be liked by him, my boss might just continue to dislike me. On this point, Adler says, you are not living to satisfy other people's expectations, and further, other people are not living to satisfy your expectations. Don't be afraid of other people looking at you. Don't pay attention to other people's judgment, and don't seek recognition from other people. Just choose the path that is best for you and that you believe in. The youth questions the philosopher in regards to how teachers are supposed to provide education to children if this goes against the idea that they must not intervene in the child's task. The philosopher states that, for example, in Adlerian psychology, counseling is thought of not as treatment, but as a place for re-education, and goes on to further say that the objective of education, in a word, is self-reliance. The point being made here is that counseling and childhood education are virtually the same thing. They both have the intention of teaching children how to become self-reliant. Adlerian psychology regards all people as beings who live their lives with the desire to escape from their helpless conditions and improve themselves. A toddler learns how to stand on two legs, acquire language, and communicate with those around him. Essentially, what all people are seeking is freedom from their helpless conditions. Education promotes this state of self-reliance as it teaches these children how to live their own lives. It is not an intervention, but rather assistance towards self-reliance. Adlerian psychology puts forth two behavioral and psychological objectives. The behavioral objectives include 1. To be self-reliant, and 2. To live in harmony with society. The psychological objectives include 1. The consciousness that I have the ability, 2. The consciousness that people are my comrades. The philosopher suggests that respect is the only form of entry into education. He references a definition of respect proposed by Erich Fromm, which goes as follows. Respect denotes the ability to see a person as he is, to be aware of his unique individuality. To develop on this point, the idea is that respect is something that should be given to the person you're interacting with. This respect is the ability to accept them as they are without the desire to change them. The ability for somebody to feel respected just as they are provides the opportunity for them to open up and thus return the respect. Naturally, however, if someone is not respected, it's unlikely they'll provide respect back. The youth points out how the typical understanding of respect is the sense of yearning, in which somebody has a desire to prove to the person they respect that they're capable of rising to the occasion. The philosopher, in response, suggests that this is not respect, but fear, subordination, and faith. The person exists in a state in which they fear power and authority, and therefore worship the false images they have of the person they respect. It is possible for somebody in a position of power to force others to complete a task, but this does not promote respect, and thus will not work to change who those people really are. For example, let's say the person at the top of a company organization is an authoritarian despot. The employees will follow his orders, certainly, and they will probably display obedient behavior, but that is submission based on fear, without an iota of respect. He can shout, "Respect me," but none of them will comply. In their hearts, they will just grow more and more distant from him. An organization like this is just assembling groups of humans to function as its nuts and bolts and gears. In the youth's case, he is capable of using his authority as a teacher to force the students to demonstrate certain behavior, but this will progressively reduce the respect that the students have for him, and the problem behavior will ultimately worsen. Yes, it begins with you. Even if there is no one who understands or supports you, first you must carry the torch, and show courage and show respect. Your torch will brighten only a few meters around you at most. It might seem like you're on a lonesome night road, all on your own, but the light you carry will reach the eyes of some hundreds of meters away. They will know then that a person is there, a light is there, and a path is there if they go to it. Eventually, dozens and then hundreds of lights will gather around you. Lights radiated by dozens and hundreds of your comrades. This is the philosopher's response to the idea that courage and respect are contagious. The point being made here is that ultimately, the only person whose actions you can influence are your own, but by changing your own actions, it's likely to influence those around you. In an education setting, the students cannot grasp the concept of respect if it's not modeled by their teacher first. I suppose this point also extends beyond an education setting as well, in the sense where being the first one to do something can be a daunting task. Perhaps in the example of protesting for a cause, it starts with one person deciding to make a change, and their courage shows other people that that change is possible. So they all pile on to help out. Having the courage to make the first move alone will enable others to stand alongside you. Adlerian psychology puts forward the term teleology. This term is used to explore the goals that are hidden in people's speech and conduct. Here, we can explore the impact of trauma on people's behavior. Regardless of what may have occurred in the past, nothing is determined by it. It does not matter if there are past traumas either, because human beings are not driven by past causes, but live according to present goals. Suppose, for example, the person who says, "My home environment was bad, and that's why I have a dark personality." This is a life lie. The truth is that person first has the goal of, "I don't want to get hurt by getting involved with other people," and in order to realize that goal, they choose a dark personality that doesn't get involved with anyone. Then, as an excuse for having themselves chosen such a personality, they bring up their past home environment. We humans are not so fragile as to simply be at the mercy of past traumas. Adler's ideas are based on the strong belief in human dignity and human potential that human beings can determine themselves at any time. Admittedly, this was a topic that took me a while to think through after reading it the first time a year ago. It seems hard to justify disregarding trauma considering the huge impacts that it can have on people's lives. From the understanding I managed to gather, it essentially suggests that people create what Adler refers to as life lies to justify their behavior. It's almost just about realizing the small link between your behavior and the past experience, rather than one being due to the other. What I mean by this is, let's say someone had a traumatic experience where they were in a car crash, for example, and from that point onwards, they were scared to drive in cars. The reality is that they aren't actually scared of driving in cars, they're scared of being put into a life or death situation again. Although this sounds obvious, understanding that the trauma is separate from the actual activity allows you to overcome that trauma. Understanding that driving in the car wasn't responsible for their trauma, that person can then recognize that they aren't dictated by that fear. Perhaps an easier to understand example is if someone was in an abusive relationship and developed attachment issues. This person may blame their ex for putting them into this situation and making them behave this way. The reality, however, is that this person is afraid of developing close attachments to people because they're afraid of being abused or treated poorly. While it's true that this fear might not have existed had they not dated their ex, by suggesting that he or she is responsible for their actions, it makes them powerless when it comes to changing how they feel. If they acknowledge that their attachment issues developed as a defense mechanism, rather than because of that person directly, they can understand that they are the ones who can change it. Adler believes that human beings can determine themselves at any time, and do not have to live in response to their past events. Understanding the link between the cause of your trauma and the resulting effects allows you to realize that you have the power to make a fresh start. The philosopher follows this point up with an interesting statement. The suggestion is that if someone has a strong wish to change, but is unable to actually go through with it, the reality is that they don't really want to change. The reason for this is because carrying out change is essentially death itself. By changing yourself, the current you is effectively dying. That version of you will never exist again, and it's permanently lost after the change is made. The person that you are at this current moment in time will die off, and a new person will be reborn in that place. Naturally then, there is significant resistance to changing yourself, as you have to put yourself into this unfamiliar situation, where you're letting the old version of you die off, and you're entering an unclear future. As a result of this, people find ways to justify that they are fine just as they are. They do not really want to make these changes, and instead affirm their current situations. An example of this put forward by the philosopher is, "I've been through a lot, but I'm fine with it." Essentially what this means is that people who are thankful for past experiences that they went through, even though they were unfavorable, are trying to affirm their current selves. A child who was rebuked harshly by a teacher, or somebody who went through a traumatic experience who was later thankful for it, stating that it helped them grow, are both affirming their current selves by affirming the past in which they were unhappy. Consequently, their entire past turns into good memories. From my interpretation of the book, it didn't seem as though the philosopher was suggesting that there was anything wrong with this behavior, and didn't provide a suitable alternative to approaching their past. He was merely explaining the thought process behind this change in approach to the past. It's definitely an interesting proposal, and I found the concept of the death of the current you to be a really interesting way of understanding why humans are resistant to change. The philosopher goes on to suggest that the past does not exist. This essentially means that it is not something that can be regained. It simply exists as a recollection of memories. In this sense, history is a grand story that is continually manipulated by the powers that be of the time. In history, it's always the now that is correct. When one authority is overthrown, a new ruler will rewrite the past again. The same situation can be explained in different ways by different people. This may be seen when our understanding of a situation changes over time as more evidence presents itself. We are essentially rewriting the past, suggesting that it never existed as a concrete thing. The philosopher provides an example of a person who was bitten by a dog as a child, after his mother told him to stay completely still upon seeing a stray dog. After being bitten, a man riding by on a bicycle stopped and rushed him to the hospital. During the philosopher's counseling with this person, they initially entered the counseling with the view that the world is a perilous place and people are my enemies. However, after thinking about the situation more, he recalled the person that helped him after the bite and began to think, the world is a safe place and people are my comrades. Was one bitten by a dog, or was one helped by another person? The reason Adlerian psychology is considered a psychology of use is this aspect of being able to choose one's own life. The past does not decide now, it is your now that decides the past. While it's obvious that the person was both bitten by the dog and helped by another person, the person is able to make the conscious decision to approach life with either an optimistic or pessimistic view from that point forward. They're capable of rewriting their past memories based on how they feel. Either they recall being attacked by the dog, or they recall being helped. If we wish to link this back to the trauma discussion, you could suggest that even though the same exact thing may happen to two people, one person may leave the situation with trauma, whereas the other person leaves the situation unfazed. It ultimately comes down to their approach to the situation, and more generally, life as a whole. They are capable of rewriting the situation mentally if they choose to. They simply just need to do it. The philosopher proposes that when most people come to counseling, or engage in conversation with friends and family, they struggle to be conscious of what they are talking about at that moment. These people complain about the unhappiness that's present within their lives. Or they speak of the hatred they have for the society around them, and the people that torment them. The philosopher had brought out a piece of paper folded into a triangular column. From where the youth sat, only two of its three faces could be seen. On one face were the words, "that bad person," and on the other, "poor me." According to the philosopher, the complaints of anxious people always ended up being one or the other. And then the philosopher slowly rotated the triangular column with his thin fingers and revealed the words written on the remaining face. The words that shook the youth's heart. "What should I do from now on?" Yes, this is precisely the point that we should be talking to each other about. What should I do from now on? We do not need that bad person or such like. Neither is poor me necessary. No matter how loudly you complain about them, I will just ignore it. I will not ignore it out of indifference. I will ignore it because there is nothing there that we should talk to each other about. If I were to listen to stories about that bad person or poor me and sympathize with your plight by saying things like, "that must have been tough," or "it's not your fault at all," it is true that you might get some temporary solace, or you might even have a sense of satisfaction that it was good to get counseling or good to consult this person. But how would that change things the next day and every day after that? Wouldn't you just want to seek more solace the next time you're hurt? Isn't that dependence? That is why, in Adlerian psychology, we talk to each other about what should one do from now on. The youth responds by suggesting that before you can address the idea of what should I do from now on, it's important to know about the until now, which would be the precondition. However, the philosopher reinforces his previous point. I repeat, the past does not exist. The past you speak of is nothing more than a story skillfully compiled by you now. Please understand this point. Understanding this point opens up the ability for discussion of how to move forward. It's easy to seek out reassurance when faced with tribulations, and it may relieve you of your struggle temporarily, but this ultimately makes you dependent on the affirmations of others. Instead of blaming others for the way you feel in the sense of that bad person, or seeking reassurance through the sense of poor me, ask yourself, what should I do from now on? This allows you to reclaim independence over your emotional state and find a long-term solution to the problem instead of simply brushing it aside temporarily. Adler's view is not one that ignores laws or rules. That is, as long as they are rules that have been created through a democratic process. Think of your classroom as a democratic nation. This is the principle of national sovereignty, where sovereign power rests with the people. The philosopher discusses how a classroom should be a democratic nation, and teachers take the role of a prime minister or president, given that students are seen as citizens. The issue here is that a teacher is not elected by the students, making the classroom environment a dictatorship rather than a democratic nation. As a result, rules of the classroom are established based on the teacher's solitary judgment, rather than on the basis of the students. This causes conflict among the students, which then forces the teacher to exercise their powers to suppress this rebellion. These powers include the ability to rebuke and praise, both of which have negative consequences. The philosopher states that in temporary Adlerian psychology, we think of human problem behavior as having 5 stages, each of which has its own mental state operating in the background. To begin with, why do children get involved in problem behavior? Adlerian psychology focuses on the goals that lie hidden in that behavior. The first stage of problem behavior is the demand for admiration. In this stage, students aim to prove to their parents and teachers and others that they are a good child. A student strives to demonstrate his work ethic and obedience to his teacher in the hopes that he receives praise. However, the issue here is that their goal will always be to receive praise and to gain a privileged position within their community. The consequence of this is that when they do not receive praise for their efforts, they lose motivation to do the work. They effectively take on the mindset that, I won't engage in proper behavior unless there is someone who will praise me, and I'll engage in improper behavior unless there's someone who will punish me. An additional problem is that since the goal of this child is to prove that they're superior to those around them and wish to gain a privileged position, they begin to cheat and apply deceptive tactics to help them achieve their goals. As a solution, the philosopher suggests that instead of focusing on whenever a child does some good thing, turn your attention to the smaller everyday details of the words and actions of the person, and then focus on and feel sympathy for that person's concerns. That's all. Doing so allows the child to feel as though they have worth and are being recognized as an individual, rather than only being recognized for the work that they produce. This encourages them to feel valuable as a person, rather than a machine who produces high-quality work. The second stage of problem behavior is attention drawing. At this stage, the child isn't being praised, even if they've done a good thing, and is subsequently unable to gain a privileged position within the classroom, or they simply lack the desire to do praise-seeking behavior in the first place. At such times, the person thinks, it's okay not to be praised, so I'll just make myself stand out. That's right. At this stage, they don't even think about being praised anymore. They just want to stand out. One aspect I'd like you to bear in mind here is that the principle of the behavior of children at this stage is standing out, not being bad. In other words, since orthodox methods such as doing their schoolwork haven't worked out, the student tries to become a special me by other means. Instead of becoming special as a good child, he tries to do so as a bad child. In this way, he secures his own place to be. The third stage of problem behavior. Here, their goals plunge into power struggles. Yielding to no one, repeated provocation, and challenging to battle. By winning that battle, each one tries to make a show of his own might. Each one tries to gain a privileged position. In a word, it's resistance. They provoke their parents and teachers and swear at them with foul language. Sometimes they become enraged and violent, or run around engaging in shoplifting and smoking cigarettes and the like, and they'll break rules without a second thought. Passive children, on the other hand, will challenge one to a power struggle through disobedience. No matter how much they're rebuked with stern words, they will refuse to engage in their studies or lessons. They'll pretend to ignore the words of the adults. They don't particularly want to study, but they don't feel that study is unnecessary either. It's simply that they want to prove their own might by being resolutely disobedient. If there is a legal struggle, then it must be dealt with in a legal manner. With any other power struggle, however, get off their court as soon as you detect it. That's the only thing you should do right away. Consider that even without making reprimands, just by looking like you're about to get angry, you'll end up standing on the court of the power struggle. The fourth stage of problem behavior. Here, the person plunges into the stage of revenge. I realize now that they aren't going to love me. If that's how it's going to be, then hate me. Pay attention to me, with that emotion of hatred. This is the kind of thing they think. At this stage, the child realizes that they won't get attention through validation or praise, so they make it their goal to be hated. This accomplishes the same end goal, in which the other person is actively thinking about them and they can influence somebody else's life. It simply just takes a different approach. An example that the philosopher provides is a child who engages in self-harm as an act of revenge on their parents. By doing so, they suggest, "It's your fault I've ended up this way." This will be a heart-wrenching experience for their parents, meaning that the child feels as though their revenge is succeeding. Man's juvenile condition is not due to lack of reason. It is that he has neither the resolution nor the courage to use his reason without direction from another. That is to say, man is responsible for being stuck in his own juvenile condition. It's easier to live according to direction from another. One does not have to think about difficult things, and one does not have to take responsibility for failure. All one has to do is swear a certain allegiance, and someone will take care of all one's troublesome tasks. People who lack self-reliance do not lack it due to an absence of knowledge or capability. Rather, they lack the confidence to rely on themselves. They are afraid to think about difficult things and take on their own tasks. Instead, they allow others to take care of their troublesome tasks for them. The idea that the philosopher proposes here is that some teachers and parents maintain an order of control over the children they're responsible for out of a fear of letting those children become self-reliant. Maintaining a dictatorship within the classroom or maintaining authority over a child enables the educator to control how the child turns out. Giving the child freedom to become self-reliant means that when the child fails at a task, the educator will be responsible. In order to evade being held responsible, the educator instead controls the child. The solution here is to then assist the child with the decisions that they have chosen to make, and convey to them that you're always there to assist them. Then, when the children make decisions which end in failure, they'll learn the lesson that one can choose one's own life, while still having your protection to fall back on. Allow the children to make the decisions, and simply act as support, instead of making decisions for the children. Moving on to a new point, the philosopher mentions how, during childhood, all humans, without exception, live with feelings of inferiority. This is a major premise of Adlerian psychology. As a result, human children have to struggle with the gap between the "what I want to do" mental aspects and the "what I can do" physical aspects. Of course, children are not incomplete as people. It's only that the growth of their bodies has not caught up with that of their minds. But then the adults look only at their physical needs and start to baby them. They do not try to look at the children's minds. So it's only natural that the children suffer feelings of inferiority, because even though their minds are no different from the adults' minds, their human worth is not being recognized. It is not all bad. This feeling of inferiority, rather than being a handicap, has always been a stimulant of effort and growth. If human legs were as fast as horses, the horse-drawn carriage would never have been invented, and probably not the motor vehicle either. Civilization is a product of the need to compensate for the biological weakness of the human being, and the history of the human race is the history of its triumphing over its inferiority. This is an incredibly intriguing point that the philosopher makes. Naturally, the most noticeable separation between children and adults is their physical capabilities. The children have the same desires and wants as their parents and caregivers, but they're unable to fulfill their desires on their own. This puts them in a state of dependence in which they're born into a natural state of inferiority. The philosopher also talks about how, instead of this state of inferiority being a negative thing, it actually enhances the rate of growth within that individual. Civilization has developed due to a want for certain things that humans have previously been unable to achieve. As humans are inferior to other animals in various ways, we've managed to minimize this inferiority through various methods, such as transport and clothing, for example. It is because of their physical weakness that humans create community and live in relationships of cooperation. Human beings always seek connection with other human beings. Community feeling exists inherently in everyone's mind. The philosopher is saying, dig up your own community feeling and seek connection with other people. Humans are born with something that is known within Adlerian psychology as community feeling. This is essentially the idea that humans are social animals by nature, and therefore have an inherent desire to feel connected with other humans. It's not that humans simply wanted to connect with others, but were required to in order to survive, due to their vulnerability alone. In Adlerian psychology, a human being's most fundamental need is the sense of belonging, because isolation leads to social death, and eventually even to biological death. As a result of this, these children aim to receive a special position within the classroom. For some, this will be achieved through the approval of the good deeds that they complete. For others, this may be through being hated, yet still achieving a position in which they stand out from those around them. Although it might seem like praising children helps to solidify their worth, the philosopher suggests that this idea is incorrect. If a child is approved by others, they will have no need to approve themselves. They will be no different from clockwork dolls that do not move unless another person winds them up. Somebody who is truly happy only upon being praised will seek to get praised more until the very last moment of their lives. Instead of seeking approval, one has to approve oneself with one's own mind. Your individuality is not something relative, it is absolute. What this means is that instead of placing worth on being different from people, place value on being yourself. A way of living in which, instead of being yourself, you compare yourself to others and try to accentuate only your difference is just a way of living in which you deceive both others and yourself. Accepting yourself as you currently are, without seeking validation, allows you to approve of yourself, without the need for others to reinforce that approval. A quick summary of the ideas at this stage might clarify any confusion. First of all, one must not rebuke children, because rebuking is conduct that damages each other's respect, and anger and reprimand are low-cost, immature, and violent means of communication. When a child is rebuked, they will lose respect for the person rebuking them. They are now submitting to the authority of the other person out of fear, not out of respect. This reduces the clarity and importance of the message being conveyed. And again, one must not praise either. Praising gives rise to the principle of competition within the community and implants in the child a lifestyle or worldview of other people are my enemies. Praising a child puts them into a competitive state in which they have to work to stand out among their peers in order to retain the praise they've been given. The praise is relative to others, measuring their performance against those around them. This naturally puts forward the idea that the child is competing versus, rather than working with, their peers. Furthermore, rebuking and praising, or in other words, reward and punishment, stand in the way of the child's self-reliance, because reward and punishment is a method of trying to keep the child under one's control, and the adult who relies on this conduct is, somewhere deep inside, afraid of the child's self-reliance. Rebuking and praising keeps the child's behavior in order. Praising a child suggests to them that they should continue doing what they are doing, and rebuking them suggests that they should avoid this less favorable behavior. This ultimately means that the children are simply fulfilling the desires of their educator, rather than making their own decisions. The educator employs these strategies to avoid having to take responsibility for the failures the child might experience if they made their own choices. The educator should remain supportive and offer their assistance, but allow the child to learn firsthand through their own decisions. Adler denies even the need for approval. He says that we should not seek approval from others, but instead switch to our own approval of ourselves. Self-reliance is one's own determining of one's worth. The attitude of the need for approval, of trying to get another person to decide one's worth, is just dependence. The philosopher goes on to discuss the difference between trust and confidence. Simply put, trust is believing in the other party with conditions. For example, when one borrows money from a bank, it goes without saying that the bank will not lend you money unconditionally. They will ask for some kind of collateral, such as real estate or a guarantor, and give you a loan that corresponds to the value of that. And they'll slap on the interest too. This is an attitude of, we'll lend to you because we believe in the value of the collateral you've given us, not one of, we'll lend to you because we believe in you. In other words, they are not believing in that person, they are believing in the conditions of that person. Whereas for confidence, it is doing without any set conditions whatsoever when believing in others. Even though one might not have sufficient grounds for believing, one believes. One believes unconditionally, without concerning oneself with such things as collateral. That is confidence. Instead of believing in the conditions of that person, one believes in that person. Work relationships are relationships of trust, and friend relationships are relationships of confidence. Work relationships are condition-based relationships that involve either some vested interest or external factors. Cooperating with someone because we happen to be at the same company, for example. Or there's a person whose personality you don't like, but he's someone you do business with, so you maintain and promote the relationship. But you have no intention of maintaining that relationship away from work. This is truly a relationship of trust that is formed as a result of the vested interest that is your work. Regardless of your individual preferences, you have to form that relationship. On the other hand, in friendship, there is no reason to befriend this person. It is not a vested interest, and neither is it a relationship that is compelled by external factors. It's purely a relationship formed out of the intrinsic motivation that, I like this person. To borrow the phrase you used earlier, one is believing in that person, not in the conditions of that person. Clearly, friendship is a relationship of confidence. The philosopher explains how the advantage humans have over other animals is that we humans did not just herd together. Humans discovered the revolutionary way of working called division of labor. Division of labor is the incomparable survival strategy that the human race acquired in order to compensate for its physical inferiority. Human beings managed to identify individual tasks that each person could do that would contribute to their survival. By dividing these labor tasks up, it enables the ability for people to specialize in one job. It is obvious then that human beings cannot survive alone. Not so much because we cannot bear being alone or desire someone to talk to, as much as the fact that we simply would not be able to survive without cooperation. Human beings do not have the choice of believing in each other. It would be impossible for us to not cooperate and not divide up the labor. A relationship, not of cooperating because one likes that person, but of having to cooperate whether one likes it or not. Trust in others is therefore a necessity for human survival. An area where division of labor is obvious is within sports. Members of a sports team might not be on good terms with one another, but the moment the game starts, the members forget their personal relationships and work together to achieve victory. It is therefore clear that ability is given precedence over good relations. If one cannot love oneself, one cannot love others. If one cannot believe in oneself, one cannot believe in others. Please think of the phrase as carrying that connotation. You are insisting that you cannot believe in other people, but that is because you have not managed to truly believe in yourself. Being self-centered does not mean looking only at oneself because one likes oneself. In actuality, the opposite is the case, and it's because one is unable to accept oneself as one is, and because one is constantly beset with anxiety, that one has concern only for oneself. The philosopher has proposed the idea that the youth should view his relationships with his students as friend relationships instead of work relationships. This is based upon the principle that praise and rebuking are both bad, and that the only way to have a relationship without those elements is to have one built upon confidence rather than trust. However, because the youth hasn't learned to like himself, he seeks to gain a sense of belonging and approval through the work he completes. However, there is one distinct flaw with seeking approval through work. In principle, we may say that it's your functions that are recognized as a result of your work, not you. If someone who possesses greater functions appears, the people around you will turn to that person. That is the principle of the marketplace, the principle of competition. As a result of that, you will never be able to get out of the vortex of competition and never gain a true sense of belonging. The way to gain a true sense of belonging is to believe in other people and embark on friend relationships. Adler claims that love is not, as some psychologists think, a pure and natural function. By this, he means that love to the human being is neither something prescribed by destiny, nor something spontaneously generated. That is to say, we do not fall in love. Rather, love is something we build. Anybody can fall in love, but building love up from nothing by our strength of will is difficult. These people might claim that love is destiny, completely stripping it of our human business and animalistic instinct. The philosopher provides an example. Suppose there's a camera you want. You're fascinated by a German-made twin-lens reflex camera that you happen to see one day in a shop window. Though you've never touched the camera and don't even know how to focus its lens, you crave to possess it someday. You would carry it with you all the time and take pictures whenever the spirit moved you. It doesn't have to be a camera. Shoes, a car, a musical instrument. It could be anything. You can imagine the feeling, right? At this time, your obsession with that camera will be just like you're falling for someone, and you will be beset by a tempest of endless desire. When you close your eyes, its form comes to you, and in the furthest reaches of your ears, you can even hear the sound of the shutter. Your condition is such that no other thing can enter your head. If it were during childhood, you might have whined and cried about it to your parents. But when you actually get the camera, you get tired of it not even 6 months later. Why do you tire of it so soon after finally getting it? Falling in love is essentially the same as becoming obsessed with a material thing. However, because the other person is a living human being, a romantic story might exist. Despite this, it remains essentially the same as the desire for material things. Adler says this: we receive education on the task that is accomplished on one's own and on the work that is accomplished by 20 people, but we do not receive education on the task that is accomplished by 2 people. A baby who learns to stand up on his own 2 feet and walk around can only learn this by himself. Nobody can accomplish this task for him. Similarly, work is a task accomplished with one's comrades. Even individual tasks have cooperators. A painter needs someone to make his paintbrush and his canvas. Therefore, in our homes and schools, we receive education with regard to tasks accomplished on our own, and those tasks that are accomplished with our comrades. However, we never receive education whatsoever on the task to be accomplished by 2 people, the task of love that Adler speaks of. The philosopher states how in love, 2 people work together to accomplish a happy life. And in order to be happy, we have to take steps within our interpersonal relationships. All human problems are interpersonal relationship problems, and all human happiness is interpersonal relationship happiness. In work relationships, we place a priority on the idea of pursuing my happiness. In friend relationships, the priority is placed on pursuing your happiness. However, love relationships seek to build the happiness of an inseparable us. From the time we're born, we go about our lives looking at the world with the eyes of me, hearing sounds through the ears of me, and pursuing the happiness of me. This is so for all people. When one knows real love, however, the subject of life changes from me to us. It allows one to live by completely new guidelines that are of neither self-interest nor other interest. The proposal here is that love is a liberation from the concept of me. When we are given life in this world, at first we reign supreme at the center of the world. Everyone in our vicinity worries about me, soothes us day and night, provides food, and even takes care of our excretions. Whenever me smiles, the world smiles too. And when me cries, the world hurries to our aid. In most cases, we are in a condition like a dictator who reigns over the household domain. Ironically, it's because of our weakness that we have control over those around us. Weakness is a powerful weapon in an interpersonal relationship. Children are not the only ones who choose such a way of living. There are many adults who treat their own weakness or misfortune, their hurt, troubled background, and trauma as a weapon and plot how they will control other people. They will try to control others by making them worry and by restricting their own words and actions. Adler referred to such adults as pampered children and was very critical of their lifestyle and worldview. The distinction between this type of person and an actual child is the physical inferiority of the child. Children are not crying because they are pampered or selfish. If they wish to live, their only option is to be the center of their world. It's necessary for their survival. However, people can't live like this forever. This explains why the objective of education is self-reliance. Self-reliance is breaking away from self-centeredness. This suggests that the act of loving is precisely the moment in which somebody shifts their life view away from a focus on the me towards focusing on us. This is a shift of the entire subject of life, and it's at this point where an individual becomes truly self-reliant. No matter how much we reign supreme at the center of the world during childhood, we are dependent on our parents to stay alive. Our parents have power over the life of this me, and if we're abandoned by our parents, we will die. Children are intelligent enough to understand this, and at some point they realize, it's because I am loved by my parents that I can go on living. Children are excellent observers. They think about the environment in which they've been placed, and take measure of the personalities and dispositions of their parents. If they have siblings, they surmise the positional relationships between them, take stock of their personalities, and consider which me will be loved. And on the basis of all these aspects, they choose their lifestyle. For example, at this point, there are children who choose the lifestyle of the good child who obeys his parents. And conversely, there are also those who choose the lifestyle of the bad child who opposes, rejects, and rebels against almost everything. The misbehaving child is frequently misunderstood as incapable of controlling their emotions. The reality is that they're actually capable of controlling their emotions all too well and turn them into action. This is because they believe that unless they take their emotions this far, they'll never gain their parents' love and attention, and their very lives will become endangered. It's simply another survival strategy. At some point, the time will come when you resolve to love someone. That will be when you achieve separation from your childhood lifestyle and achieve true self-reliance, because it's through loving others that we at last become adults. An interesting observation that the philosopher makes is that in the youth's case, from early childhood onward, since his brother was older than him, no matter what he did, he had more power and more experience, and never had the slightest chance of winning. Now, what could you do about it? According to Adler, in general, the youngest child chooses a path that differs completely from the other members of his family. This tendency takes place because the youngest child has a desire to stand out, and can't do this while following in the footsteps of those who came before them. Therefore, they take on a different life path that provides them with the ability to gather attention and realize their own worth. Going back to the idea of love, the youth mentions how the only way he can dispel his feelings of inferiority is by meeting a person who accepts and loves him as he is. The philosopher asks, so in other words, your position is, if you love me, I will love you. So, after all, you are only seeing, will this person love me? You seem to be looking at the other person, but you're only seeing yourself. No matter what sort of dictator I might be, I cannot force people to respect me. In a relationship of respect, the only way is for the respect to come from me first. Love cannot be forced either. As Fromm remarked, loving someone is not simply an intense emotion, it is a decision, it is a judgment, it is a promise. The philosopher ends the conversation with the line, "Love is all. The person who lives wanting an easy life or looking for the easy way may find fleeting pleasures, but they will not be able to grasp real happiness. It is only by loving another person that we're liberated from self-centeredness. It is only by loving another person that we can achieve self-reliance, and it's only by loving another person that we arrive at community feeling. The world is simple, and life is too, but keeping it simple is difficult, and it is there that the passage of days becomes one's trial." Alright, so we've arrived at the end of the book discussion, and that was quite a long one. There were so many ideas that I just had to fit it all in, and this is by far my longest book review. But the concepts in this book are so complex that it's hard to fully understand them. I've revisited this idea and the ideas mentioned in the book numerous times, both through the fact that this book followed up on the ideas of the previous book, and also because I had to understand the concepts in order to explain them in this book commentary. Regardless, it's something that I'll continue to have to revisit, and all the ideas in this book that are mentioned are incredibly thought-provoking, and they typically go against the natural expectations we hold as humans. Adler was an unconventional thinker who liked to take uncommon approaches to topics, and for this, I'm grateful to have such a book that can encourage such deep thinking. I agree with the fundamental principles of this book, namely the separation of tasks. I follow this idea in my daily life, and I've implemented it since I read the first book, The Courage to be Disliked. The only issue is that this task is quite difficult to employ in most real-life situations. I can always do my part to ensure that I hold true to this concept, but it's not an approach that many others will take, and that in itself is the idea of the separation of tasks, as nothing I can do can change the other person's approach to their life, but it's simply worth acknowledging that this is more of a personal life philosophy that you take on board, rather than something that the majority of people will agree to take on board. While watching this book discussion, it's perfectly understandable if some topics I discussed are confusing to you, or if they just didn't make any sense whatsoever. And admittedly, this is due to the fact that there are some concepts within the book that I don't know well enough to explain. I simply hope that this book acts as a gateway into the ideas of Alfred Adler and the branch of Adlerian psychology. I also hope that it encourages you to seek out this book and the previous book for yourself, as well as doing further research into the topic. In regards to Adler's proposal that the youngest child chooses a path that differs completely from the rest of the family members, this is definitely applicable to my life, because my family took the approach of like engineering, computer science, stuff like that, whereas I took a more artistic approach with music and creating videos, stuff like that. And of course that doesn't mean that it's a rule. It could simply be a coincidence that my life experience aligns with what he says, but it's worth observing that I did fall into this category, so there might be something to it. With that being said, that brings us to the end of the book review. This book was pretty incredible. It's a confusing book, but I think there are so many thought-provoking ideas, and it encourages you to think deeply about the book. I don't know if I've ever read a book where I've had to stop so many times while reading to actually just form my own opinion in regards to what I've read. So if you want a book that challenges you and allows you to sort of reevaluate and think about your life approaches and your life philosophy, this is definitely the book for you. I recommend this book. I definitely recommend the first book, The Courage to be Disliked, and I would suggest read that one first. Out of the two, I prefer that one, but that's purely because it sets the foundation. So naturally, it was more impactful on my life because I had to implement those things before I could read this book. But reading this two-part series will absolutely change your life approach. Even if you don't agree with the ideas and you don't take anything on board, it simply forces you to rethink life in general and think about childhood, the way that children are raised, the way that you raise a child, and also the things that you bring from your childhood into your present life that you've never addressed. Thanks for watching the video. Next week, we'll be reviewing Sleep Smarter by Shawn Stevenson. It's an incredibly interesting book, and it's a more light-hearted approach to the idea of sleep. It essentially touches on the detrimental effects of sleep deprivation and talks about how you can improve the quality of your sleep, but it has a lot of funny lines. Shawn Stevenson has a lot of one-liners in there that actually make me chuckle, and for a book about sleep, I didn't think it could be that amusing to read, but it definitely is. So stick around for that one, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.